Hi storytellers, and welcome back to the Create a Story You Love YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be continuing with part 3 of a 7-part video series on 7 steps to nail down the beginning stages of your novel before you start writing. And if you haven't watched the first and the second video, I encourage you to go back and watch those videos. Part 1, how to brainstorm your story ideas and topics that you're passionate to write. And part 2, how to write and tie in memories or themes from your life with story tropes that inspire you. And in today's video, part 3, we will be talking about writing a short summary of the story idea that sparks your interest and passion, and then write a 1-sentence book premise. So just wanted to say a little aside here. The ideas I share in this video series are brainstorming techniques that have helped me to write my own novels, but it's important to remember that all writers are unique and in their own way, and what works for you might not be what has worked for me. And so I really want to encourage you to experiment with different methods for brainstorming your own story ideas and come up with a way that works best for you. That being said, let's dive into why it's important to write a summary and start with a 1-line premise. So it's important to lay down the foundations before you begin writing your novel, to have a clear path right from the start. There are well-known and best-selling authors like James Patterson who have a marketing background, who understand this and begin each book with a great idea and a story summary and a 1-line premise, and then also create very compelling titles, and subtitles for their books. They're captivating and attracting the right readers to their books. So as fiction writers, we want to think like that too. That way our books have the best chance of selling well to our target readers. That's why an important third step to nail down your novel before you start writing is to brainstorm and write a short summary of your story, inspired by the ideas you wrote down from part 1 and part 2 of this video series. So your summary is simply a 1-page story that highlights the main ideas of your story. It's important to include highlights such as your hero's ordinary world and the catalyst, which is sort of like the inciting incident that forces them to accept the call to adventure. Sketch out the hero's flaws and fears with a glimpse of their backstory and their mentor that helps them in the adventure. Just a quick note on digging deeper into your heroes and your main secondary characters' wounds and fears. I find it helpful to look through ideas of possible backgrounds for my hero as I go through The Emotional Wound Thesaurus by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. I often have many aha moments as I read through the categories that are included with each topic. For instance, for the middle grade adventure novel that I'm writing right now, one of the topics I was looking up in the Emotional Wounds Thesaurus was experiencing the death of a parent as a child or youth. Reason being was because my heroine's mother recently died at the very start of this book. So I looked inside and looked under that category or under that title, experiencing the death of a parent as a child or youth. And then I continued down the page and I read through the subcategories that were listed. So number 1, false beliefs that could be embraced when a child loses a parent or a loved one. One could be people die when you need them the most, or B, it's better to hold back than love someone completely. Another thing I learned was number 2, the character may fear being abandoned or rejected, or vulnerability that comes with fully loving someone. And then I scanned down even further on that page under that topic, and 3, I learned possible responses and results could be viewing life differently due to loss of innocence or difficulty feeling secure. And then more triggers that might aggravate this wound of losing a parent or a loved one as a child. The date of the parent's death, or a difficult decision or personal struggle where parental advice would be welcome. And then opportunities to overcome this wound could could be losing a second parent or meeting someone who suffered a similar loss and being able to process it together. So those are just some examples, sort of digging deeper into your character's wounds and fears, because this is helpful to know for when you come to the middle of the book, so that they are aware of the mirror moment, as James Scott Bell puts it in his book. I'll link to it below. But he talks about the mirror moment and how that's usually pretty much right in the middle of the book, where the character sees themselves exactly as they're supposed to. Like, it's that turnaround moment, right? The mirror moment. It's helpful to go through, to dive deeper into who your characters are. And then for a next step, it's good if you can ask questions like, what revelation does my hero have in the middle of the story? For example, as I'm brainstorming my character who has just become an orphan, her revelation might be that even though she feels it's safer to hold back from loving others because of her fears of rejection or abandonment or loss, but perhaps her revelation that comes from an experience maybe she had or a conversation is that being vulnerable might be scary, but it's worth it in the end to learn that you are valued and loved for who you are. So that might be a possibility. Brainstorm what revelation your hero might have in the middle of your book that you're writing. Other questions to ask: what are their greatest fear that the hero will need to face at the climax? And this will become their all is lost moment. What your hero fears the most is what they will need to face at the climax. For example, in my story, perhaps my orphan girl's greatest fear is being abandoned again by someone she loves. So at the climax, she would need to face someone who she has come to love abandoning her for some reason. Now, that character might come back into her life or change their mind at the conclusion of the story, but still at the climax, the hero would need to face that fear. So after you've brainstormed the climax, remember to include the aha moment the hero has as they enter Act 3. These are the important points to include in your story's summary. Hopefully the tips I just mentioned above help give you more clarity to help you write your short summary. After you've finished writing the summary of your story, next, write down a one-line premise for your story. And this is sometimes called an elevator pitch. I think the reason they call it an elevator pitch is, when people would pitch their stories to someone in Hollywood, they would have only like a minute or two from being inside an elevator to pitch it to like a story executive or something. So that's why I think that's where that name came from. Anyway, if you're curious. Following up with the premise or the elevator pitch, it's a one-line sentence that will be very compelling and will offer some sense of conflict or character motivation. When someone hears the premise, they should be compelled to read your book. So what exactly is a book premise? It's the underlying idea behind your story. It's similar to a main storyline or concept, but punchier. We're nailing down your story with a book premise into something short, a one-liner that is succinct and just as important, that will grab readers' attention and sell your book. A book premise is really the backbone of your novel, and it's very useful focus to have in front of you as you write. So you'll want it to be compelling, and you'll want it to offer readers some sense of conflict or character motivation. When a reader hears a good premise, you want that they will be compelled to read the book. That's really what the goal is. And so that's why premise is really compelling. So ideally, it's best to wait to write your book until you have fleshed out a clear premise line. So some tips for a clear premise line is that it should be easy to write. If it isn't, your story concept might be too complicated. You can also think of it as of a strong premise line as an elevator pitch. So here are some examples from fairy tales. Sleeping Beauty, here would be like a premise line. A princess falls asleep for 100 years and must be rescued by a prince's kiss. So short, but that there's going to be, a conflict, that there is conflict, that she's asleep for 100 years and must be rescued by the prince. Another example, Hansel and Gretel. Two children are lured into a witch's gingerbread cottage and must escape. So you can tell that there's conflict there. They must escape from the gingerbread cottage. Other premise lines from best-selling novels. A teenage girl must fight 11 teens to the death in a dystopian kill zone. Can you guess the book? The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. So other premise lines from best-selling novels. Science brings dinosaurs back to life and puts them in a theme park. This is Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. So what makes a good book premise? Number one, a good premise contains conflict or opposing forces. For example, a situation that puts two characters together, like in The Hunger Games, a teenager against 11 heavily armed other teenagers. A conflict can be a fight between two characters, or it can also be metaphorical. The conflict is between what the main character wants, their goals and desires, and the obstacles that are standing in their way of getting what they want. Number two, a good premise should be simple enough that a child can understand it. The average child over 7 should be able to understand what your story is about from your premise, which is, good to remember, because that way it'll be really clear. Even your wording, the words you use, will be very clear and succinct and simple, that anyone, a child over 7 or older could really understand your premise, which is great. Number 3, a good premise also creates conflict. For instance, in The Hunger Games, the premise: a girl is thrown into an arena with 11 other teens, all of whom want to kill her. So really, you know that the conflict is that it's kill or be killed, which makes the stakes really high, and it will be impossible to write this premise without conflict, which is really good, because that really, is captivating to readers. So conflict can be something violent and life-threatening, or it can be two characters with conflicting motivations. So here's another example from Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We understand the conflict by the title. The hero, Mr. Darcy, is proud, and the heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, is prejudiced. Elizabeth dislikes proud and rich people, probably because her family are on the lower echelons of polite society. And Mr. Darcy is aloof, proud, and rich. So there we have conflict. Two people with very different outlooks and experiences on life. We know they're bound to come to some kind of disagreements and conflict. So we have character clash, which makes the story more interesting. The conflict will be resolved by the end of the story. Readers, and humans in general, are fascinated by conflict and resolution. We are desperate to see how the drama unfolds and how it is resolved by the end of the novel. Some tips to help you create a strong premise is to ask what-if questions. For example, from Twilight by Stephanie Meyer. What if you fell in love with a vampire? By creating a what-if question like that, it helps you get a clear focus and a conflict in one sentence. Try writing a what-if question that fits with the chosen genre you have decided to write. For example, if you're writing a romance, ask, what if a serious, business person, for example, and a flighty and scatterbrained artist got together? What kind of conflicts can you create? Or, if you were writing a thriller, you'd likely have a darker and more intriguing mystery-type questions. A common one in thrillers would be, what if you wake up and don't know who or where you are? So after you have your what if question, then you add more conflict and make sure the stakes are very high. Examples of high stakes for the character. Will your hero lose his or her standing in society? Will they lose their family, their child, or even their life? If you have a strong premise, writing the sales paragraph later on will be easy, and from there you can use the one-sentence premise line to focus on while you write your manuscript. Your premise line is your focus on the main character, their motivation and conflict. Try to get rid of any detail that doesn't need to be there. What does your main character really want, and what are the obstacles that they are having to overcome? This is your story's premise. And so after you've written a short summary of your story and you've nailed down your one-line premise, these are details that are helpful to have in place before you start putting in the many hours it'll take to write your story. This will help bring focus to your writing, and it will help you to have a strong story at the end of it. So after you're done that, you will be ready for the next video in this series. The next video is part 4, which is coming up next. In this step, we will talk about how to brainstorm and write down details about your main character. What is their story and personality, and learning how to pick details you relate to and understand. We've touched a little bit on character, getting deeper into character today, but I'll share what that looks like in the next video. Thanks for joining me today, and I'm excited for you as you begin your journey to write amazing stories. If you've enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe below so other new writers can find this video too. Happy writing!